นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening, good afternoon, good morning. One of the ways we learn the Dhamma, the teachings of the Buddha, is through reflecting on different teachings that the Buddha gave, what we call supasita, means wise or beneficial speech, as opposed to dubhasita, which means unskillful, harmful speech. And one of the kinds of or sayings of the Buddha that you'll hear a lot in Buddhist monasteries is Jittang Dang Tang Sukhawahang. The well-trained mind brings happiness. It's a saying from the Buddha. It just points out the fact that if we are to find true happiness, peace in life, we have to train our mind. That's what we were doing just then when we were meditating. You were training your mind in mindfulness, or to bring up mindfulness where perhaps there wasn't mindfulness before, or only a little bit. You were training yourself to bring it up, to have more and more continuous mindfulness. That's a form of training. We also train in practice of generosity, even though you might not realize it. That's something you train in. You develop the habit of generosity and kindness in daily life, helping others, supporting the Sangha, practicing charity, and so on. We train in morality. We cultivate the intention to refrain from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, taking intoxicating drink and drugs. We train in meditation and the qualities that meditation brings up, like mindfulness and then wisdom, insight. So the Buddhist path is a form of training. Training of our actions, training of our speech, and training of the mind, and particularly the mind. And that's one way the Buddha encouraged us to live as human beings, is to take life by the reins, take charge of our life. Because again, that's what training is. You're consciously using your time here as a human being to develop certain qualities. The purpose of it, the point of it, is to free yourself from stress, suffering. So that's how in Buddhism we define happiness, your mind that is free from suffering. But to free our mind from suffering, we have to train to identify, recognize the causes of suffering, and then abandon them, let them go, if we are to experience the end of suffering. And all the Buddhist path is kind of revolves around this, training the heart, training the mind sometimes we use the word heart interchangeably with mind. It can be confusing, but I think if you practice Dhamma and listen to the Dhamma regularly, you get it. Sometimes heart sounds right, sometimes mind sounds right, but we use them interchangeably. And we're changing, we're developing and changing our mind for the better through the practice, through this training, by abandoning mental defilements, often referred to as kilesa, asava. By abandoning mental defilements, we are removing the causes of suffering from our mind. And that takes training. That's why we train. We use the word practice as well. And again, you can use the training and practice interchangeably, perhaps. So practicing the Dhamma, we're learning to recognize the causes of suffering in our experience, these mental defilements, and having recognized them, to abandon them, let them go, finish with them. And the Buddha would be quite clear on this. He said, we're aiming to actually completely eradicate them from the mind, cut them off, and so they never return. He would give similes and metaphors of things like cut off like a palm stump. If you have a palm tree or you ever see a palm tree that gets cut in half, it won't regrow, because then palm trees are not able to regenerate sort of from halfway up the trunk like some other trees can. Like eucalyptus trees here in the forest in Australia, sometimes they get struck by lightning and break in half, or they get burned by a bushfire, but then they re-sprout. They carry on again. But palm trees, you cut them halfway up and that's it. They just die. They can't regrow. And the Buddha said that's what you're aiming for when we say abandoning mental defilements rooted in greed, anger, delusion, fear, anxiety, jealousy, rage, and all the kind of different kinds of mental defilements that we get to know as we meditate. The aim is to abandon them completely so they never return. So if I was a Buddhist traveling salesman trying to sell the product to you, I'd say this product will solve all your problems, because having trained or practiced with the Buddhist path, you will never have to be bothered by greed, anger, delusion again. You will never have to suffer again. What better description or advertisement for something could be than that? We just had a retreat here in our hall over the Christmas, New Year. Had a lot of people, monks and lay people, staying here, and they use the hall every day. So I was just walking up and down in the hall, and I noticed there's a lot of stains. Our carpet is getting old, and with a lot of people, you get stains from dirty feet, or they spill something. But imagine if you had a product that would remove all stains, and then you never have to deal with stains again, ever in your life. You would like that. You would want that. Because life is full of stain removal, isn't it? It's like we have to clean our houses, clean our clothes, clean our car, clean up all kinds of business in the world, earn money, pay bills. You say paying bills is a kind of clean-up job so that you're no longer in debt. Life is full of that. So if you had a product or something that would end all of that, and you'd never have to clean another stain, pay another bill, clean up anything again, never have to weed your garden again, well, it's a very attractive proposition. And the Buddha offers that for you. And it's free too. All you have to do is train. Train your mind, and you can have happiness, true happiness, lasting happiness. When the Buddha says "Citam tang tang sukhavahang," he's not talking about some passing, fleeting happiness of just getting what you want in the present moment, feeling relaxed, feeling high, feeling blissful, being content or satisfied with something just for a few moments. No, he was talking about permanent, lasting peace of mind, purity of mind even. Because the product the Buddha was bringing to the world, again, he wasn't selling it, he was giving it free, is for complete removal of suffering. By removing the causes of suffering from a human mind, greed, anger, delusion, and all their associated mental states. So we call another word we use for kilesa is impurity. So purifying the mind from impurities and never to be impure again. Once somebody has removed greed, anger, and delusion from their experience, completely cut off like a palm stump, then that's it. Never to return, never to grow again. So a garden that never needs to be weeded again, a carpet that never has to have stains removed again, never have to pay another bill again. All those kind of annoying little things that we go through in life and keep having to do over and over again and kind of wear us down and sometimes, disappoint us, tire us out. Never having to do any of that again is the mind that has abandoned mental defilements through this practice, through this training. That's what the Buddha was teaching. His shortest way of describing was, I teach suffering and the end of suffering. And we love that because nowadays everyone is so impatient to get rid of their suffering. Somebody says, I teach the end of suffering. Well, it sounds very attractive. But when you elaborate on it, and the Buddha did elaborate on it for 45 years, there's a bit more to it than just one simple action or one pill or one button pressed or one thought, one idea. It's not quite as simple as that. There's a whole process of, as I said, recognizing mental defilements or mental impurities that cause us suffering and then abandoning them. But in one way, the Buddha was correct because he was saying, I teach suffering and the end of suffering. And that end of suffering comes when you remove the causes of suffering, greed, anger, and delusion, then you get the end of suffering. And some people are ready to remove them right here and now very quickly. Some people will take many lifetimes, perhaps. That's too much to imagine, isn't it? We can't imagine many lifetimes. Maybe one lifetime, okay, we can imagine that. So some people will take a whole lifetime to do it. The Buddha didn't say, because he was giving general teachings that apply to everyone, but he didn't say you or me or anyone by name, or he's not talking to us here now in this day and age, but he's just giving this general principle that if you remove the causes of suffering, you will reach the end of suffering. But how quickly it will happen, how much effort you'll have to put in, that depends, doesn't it? It depends on you. But there is this thing available called the Dhamma and the path of practice that the Buddha taught. It's available to us right here, right now, freely available, and we can do it if we choose to. we can remove all these stains from our heart, our mind, and experience the highest happiness. That was one part of the Buddha's message. But then we have to go back to the reality. Is, oh, but there is a lot of confusion and suffering left in our mind. We have all kinds of stressful thoughts and issues and problems, and we still have many bills to pay and many debts to pay off. It's another way of talking about life, isn't it? Life is a continual paying off of debts, and I don't just mean money debts. I mean debts to other people, debts to yourself, debts to the world, because we live in the world and we're using the things of the world. We kind of get in debt. So we still have many debts to pay. There's a long way to go, maybe. But the actual principles are what we have to learn first. Learn the Dhamma, learn the method, the way of practice, the way of training, and then keep applying it. So some people do apply it very well, you know, like anything in life, there are always a few geniuses around, virtuosos, who understand these guidelines, principles that the Buddha gave very quickly. Maybe just innately sharp. And not necessarily somebody who's, you know, done a PhD in Buddhism or, you know, studied the world and knows all kinds of things about the world. Maybe that person could, but maybe somebody from a very humble, simple background. I've been lucky enough to meet some very wise, peaceful, enlightened monks, and you know, some of them had very little formal education, never went anywhere near a university or a college of higher education. Maybe just had the barest minimum of education to learn to read and write, and yet they managed to train themselves very well to remove greed, anger, delusion from their mind, completely cut off like a palm stump. Some monks very quickly. One monk, I often quote Lumo Buddha, who had a great love for Ajahn Chah, my teacher, and Ajahn Chah reciprocated, had a great respect for Lumo Buddha as well. Lumo Buddha was said to become an arahant in 4 years of practice, which would be nice, to completely remove greed, anger, and delusion from your mind in just 4 years of effort. He probably tried very hard in his practice. From what I know of him, yes, he did. He went out and he meditated and basically set aside everything for his practice of the Dhamma, which is why perhaps his training went quickly and he completed the course, as it were, quickly. I wouldn't say easily, because anyone who completely removes greed, anger, delusion from their mind will have put forth a lot of effort and gone through many obstacles. Nevertheless, it wasn't for very long, 4 years, and he reached Nibbana, the end of suffering. Another way the Buddha talked about it is the spotless vision of the Dhamma. So it's this sense of impurity, all impurities removed. The mind becomes spotless, radiant, unblemished, and therefore without suffering. So he did that in 4 years. And he seemed to embody that when I met him, which was later in his life when he was older, but he seemed to be very, very peaceful, pure, unblemished in his whole being, very wise, compassionate being. But that came from 4 years of practice, and then he spent the rest of his life kind of being a blessing to the world, teaching and supporting other people in their practice. And that's what you can do when you reach that spotless, immaculate vision of Dhamma. Then you become a blessing to the world. And so if you reach it very quick, then you can be a real blessing to the world. Because imagine if you reach after 4 years, you might live for another 50 years. The Buddha lived for 45 years after his enlightenment. Lumo Buddha lived for I believe, I may be wrong here, he died when he was like 101 or something. So he was probably a monk for roughly 70 odd years, an enlightened monk for 70 odd years. That's a long time to be around to bless the world with his pure mind. Nevertheless, that's what he did. Probably why Lumpur Cha respected him so much, but the respect was mutual, and he really loved Lumpur Cha because Lumpur Cha took a bit longer to remove all his blemishes and clean up his carpet, or the carpet of his mind, or the weeds of his garden of his mind. He took a bit longer, but once he had done it, he became a very good teacher. Maybe that's one benefit for taking a bit longer in your practice. So if you're feeling disheartened that you're taking a while to deal with your own greed, anger, and delusion, and you still have lots of suffering and stress in your life, and you're dealing with pain and discomfort and problems, okay. But as you work through all of that, and it may take a little bit longer than, say, Lumo Buddha did, you gain a lot of wisdom and a lot of compassion. So they say Lumpur Cha took a bit longer to become enlightened. We don't really know. He never said exactly when he became enlightened. So we guess it may be after he started his monastery, Wat Nongpapong, which started when he'd been a monk for about 15 years. So at the very least, it took him 15 years, perhaps a bit longer, to become enlightened. Perhaps we'll never really know. But they say because it took him a bit longer, maybe that helped him to become a really wise, compassionate teacher. So don't be too downhearted if you're dealing with a lot of mental states of distraction, confusion, pain in your body, worries, fears, all kinds of greed and desire, all the normal things that we face when we meditate and practice meditation regularly. Don't be disheartened, because that will make you very wise. Because if you deal with all those things and you work out ways to let go of your cravings and attachments, working through them, seeing the suffering of them, suffering with them, and then letting go until they're finally removed, well, you can use all that food or information you've gained from your practice, from your training, to help other people. So sometimes the enlightened person who went through a lot of suffering and difficulty becomes a very good teacher. And so that's what they say for Lumpur Cha. They say he became such a good teacher, not of just of Thai people, but also people from all around the world have benefited from Ajahn Chah's lessons, which are so simple but so profound. And partly because he himself went through a lot of suffering. But he didn't give up, and he kept going, and he came out the other side. He cleaned up his mind, and then he had learned all these lessons which he shared with us. So if you say you read his biography or you read his talks and hear how he talked about working with the mind, you realize he really understood the human mind very well. And he was quite good at sharing that with others and seeing where other people are going wrong, because it almost seemed like he'd made every mistake in the book. And so he was able to tell people and show people how to get beyond their own attachments and problems and suffering very well. He's a very effective teacher. So that may be the case for you. Just like the the head chef who came to stay here, who had been stressed out. I quite often quote him, but realized that getting stressed out in his job, because if you've ever been in a position as a head chef in a busy restaurant, catering service or whatever, you'll know what I mean. There's a lot you have to run at the same time. You have to run people, other chefs and cooks and staff, and you have to budget and you have to prepare the food, and there's always obstacles and problems, and then you have to deal with customers as well. So I think most people say it can be quite a stressful, difficult job. But his reflection was, when he came into the monastery, was all the things he'd learned doing that may actually make him enlightened quicker. That's the right attitude to have. If you want to train your mind for happiness, you have to take your suffering as a lesson every time, and that might mean you actually get enlightened quicker if you treat your suffering as something to learn from, as a lesson, as a teaching. So although the Buddha taught suffering and the end of suffering, the bit in between is learning lessons from suffering until you finally worked out where these mental defilements are and how they cause you suffering, and then you let them go. So wisdom in Buddhism, the highest form of training is in wisdom. The hardest thing to develop is wisdom, but how we define wisdom is seeing suffering and its cause, and then recognizing the causes of suffering as causes of suffering, and then letting them go, abandoning them. Because really, if we're still suffering after all these years of practice, that's a sign we haven't yet fully done that. That's why it does take longer for some people. Some of those mental defilements are deeply ingrained. They're like habits of mind that keep returning, keep coming back, keep catching us out because of delusion and not really seeing them clearly. Then we keep suffering. So you have to, if you're still suffering in your life, you still have stress, you still get angry, you still get worried, you still are not peaceful, then there's something you need to look at more deeply there. That's kind of your insight if you're following the Buddhist path. The insight is, on where am I attaching? Where am I suffering here? Why do I identify so strongly with this greed that it keeps getting me over and over again? You're still just a eucalyptus tree regrowing. You're not yet a palm tree cut off. You don't want to be a eucalyptus tree that endlessly grows. You want to be a palm tree that's cut off and doesn't regrow. So why is that? Why are you still falling for the same old desires, same old reactions? Your buttons are getting pushed over and over again, triggering the same old fears and anxieties and worries and anger, because you haven't quite seen yet. I'm speaking for myself here as much as anyone else. We all are practicing to try and recognize these defilements that sneak into the mind. But the good news is that, the mind isn't inherently defiled. The mind is kind of new. It's just it gets covered over by the dirt, the impurities of the defilements. But they're not the same thing. They're a layer of experience that we say conditions the mind and leads on to all kinds of mental proliferation, negative thinking, which is what stress and suffering is, isn't it? But then that stress and suffering is not inherent to the mind. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be let go of, finished with. And that's the message of the Buddha, that if you keep training, keep practicing, you can go beyond suffering. You can end it. You can cut off the causes of suffering, just like a palm tree is cut when it's cut off at the stump, and it will never regrow. It will never return. One reflection I got from Ajahn Chah is that you have to accept there'll be some mental defilements that maybe do seem very deeply ingrained and big, and you're not going to let go of them today. Maybe you're not ready for that. You have to accept that. But on the other hand, there may be some small ones that you can identify and let go of quite quickly, that you maybe today, this very day, can let go of. So letting go of mental defilements, you do it on different levels, in different ways, using different techniques, different reflections. But sometimes you can let go of simple little things first. The small things, the small victories, the small insights can be developed, even if the big one we're not yet ready to do. And that's what you might find as you meditate. If you try, put enough effort into your meditation, that will require regular practice, and then reflecting regularly on what's going on in your mind, even if you're not doing formal meditation, but just taking time to either go for walks or runs or sit down and just look at your mind and what's going on day by day. If you're willing to do that, that process of observing yourself, turning your attention back on your own mind, you can't help but start noticing things where you're attaching, reacting in some same old way, some habit towards another person. Say, there'll be people you love and like, but maybe cling on too much and then get disappointed when you're not with them, or they go away from you or exit your life or something. And then there's those people you do like, or you don't like, and you don't want, but you keep meeting and you keep reacting to them. Just something as simple as that, how you relate to certain people around you in your day, in your life, the likes and dislikes, the wants, the not wants. Recognizing that, but seeing it now as Dhamma, as suffering, and say, oh, if I keep reacting with anger, I'm suffering to a certain person. You have to be clear when you do become more introspective, which is a big part of it, meditation, is turning your attention inwards, looking at what's going on, looking at cause and effect, the processes of the mind. See how you add on negativity, stress to experiences. So if it's another person that you have attachment to, if it's the negative form of attachment, you don't like them, don't want them, just see how you're adding on suffering to your experience. Whether it's just the memory of them, which you bring up in your mind, and then that stimulates a whole lot of negative mental proliferation. Or when you're with them, what does it do to you when you're with them in their presence? The tension in your body, the negative thought, the anxiety or the anguish, whatever it is, start noticing how that is something you are creating from your mind, reacting to them rather than them doing to you. So it's a change of perspective, coming back to look at your own mental experience. And in a way, you can even ignore the person who is the sort of cause of that. We always say, oh, I'm angry or I'm unhappy because of them. But really, you can just set them aside and just go back and look at your own anguish, your own reaction, your own negativity, and say, this is my suffering. This is something I have to let go of, cut off, abandon. Sure, in daily life, we have to adjust things as well, how we relate to people. So if someone is difficult to you or harmful to you, or sometimes we have to change things around a bit. But here we're looking inwardly, and that's why we have to take time out to be with ourselves, meditate, look at the mind, and see where you can really let go of your own negative mental proliferation. Because that's not part of who you are, that's not part of the mind. It's an experience that comes in, arises, passes away, and can be abandoned, can be changed. And there are those people, monks, nuns usually, but lay people as well, of course, who have practiced and managed to let go of this kind of thing by working with themselves patiently over time, training their mind in mindfulness, in the case of negativity, cultivating goodwill, compassion, but mainly mindfulness to see that these negative reactions are not a self, they're not a person, they're mental states that come into the mind and then go away again and can be let go of. And maybe you contemplate it to the point where the next time you're going to fall into that same mental state, you just say, no, I'm not going to do this anymore because I've seen it suffering. That's, you might say, a definition of an insight. People often ask, what is an insight in meditation or in Buddhism? Or if you've seen a certain way of thinking is suffering, a certain emotional reaction to things is suffering, and you say, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. You have enough clarity, you've contemplated it enough times, established mindfulness enough times to let go. Maybe slightly harder and more subtle is on the more positive side, the attraction to things. So if it's a person you're attracted to, that's still going to lead to suffering, isn't it? You know, where does anger come from? It comes from not getting what you want, getting what you don't want. Part of that is stimulated by attraction. Because if you're attracted to something, you want something, you like something, and you don't get it, that also makes you angry. For sure, it makes you suffer. Even when you get the thing you want, you suffer because it doesn't last, does it? The pleasure doesn't last, the person or the thing doesn't last. So it's a little harder to deal with, but still we have to keep looking at that, bring our attention inwards and look at the mind of attraction, pleasure seeking, wanting, attaching or clinging to people, to the pleasure they bring us, the happiness they bring us, all the good things we think they can bring us. One way that helps us to see the suffering of attraction and aversion is practicing mindfulness. As you meditate and develop stronger mindfulness, say as we were doing earlier, like mindfulness of breathing, as your mind becomes more used to being with the breath and more used to letting go, you see how attraction and aversion cause suffering because you see them as movements of the mind. You know, the mind moves out of its stillness and mindfulness and starts to proliferate. And you see that that is suffering. The movements of the mind are kind of endless, how your mind gets triggered over and over again. It's not really free. Keeps following the same moods, the same habit patterns, the same thought proliferation. But as you become more mindful, maybe you have enough awareness and enough strength of mind to say, no, I'm not going to go down that same old route. I'm just going to sit here in my equanimity with the breath, for instance. You get a much clearer idea of what the mind free from suffering is. And even at the moment when suffering is being triggered, don't go with it. You maybe have enough strength, maybe not every time, but sometimes, to not go with it. And then you can see, oh, this is like a little victory. There are some times when I'm strong enough, mindful enough just to let go or ignore certain thoughts, certain reactions that come up. And then you get a slightly deeper peace than you had before. You know, in meditation, we talk about the peace of samadhi, the peace of the mind that has mindfulness, is calm. But then there's the peace of wisdom, which is even better. That's why we call it higher peace, higher happiness. And that's something you have to train to the point where you really understand it, see it for yourself. And you know, if I let go of this, there's nothing lost, only gain of peace, freedom of mind. It's not just with people, it can be any situation that triggers suffering. So it could be painful feelings in your body is a huge one, isn't it? We spend a lot of our life reacting to pain, or even just the threat of pain or the worry about possible pain, discomfort, injury. But when you keep bringing up mindfulness, reflecting on, particularly on impermanence of those painful feelings, impermanence of your negative reaction to the painful feeling, maybe you can save yourself a bit of time and suffering by just saying, oh, I'm just going to stay mindful here rather than run with the negative reaction to the pain. I'll know the pain, and it takes some patience and effort to do that, but then just to know it and let go. So the reflection on impermanence runs straight into the reflection on not self. Because what is impermanent, it cannot be a self. It's nothing permanent, lasting. We say it's a condition of mind, a sankhara. Reflecting on impermanence around pain really can quickly bring you a sense of peace and letting go. Sometimes you have to experiment with this. You know, when say you're meditating, you're in the best position to experiment. When you're meditating, you can really learn from your situation, bringing up the right qualities, the mindfulness, the patience, the effort and energy, and then reflecting to develop some insight. So when you're meditating, experiment. So you have a bit of pain and just see how there's an immediate dislike and an immediate wanting to get rid of. But don't move and don't do anything, just watch. And watch how your reaction may pass quite quickly. Even if the physical pain or the source of it keeps returning, your reaction to it may dissolve quite quickly. And if you're mindful enough, observant enough to see that, then you're proving exactly what the Buddha taught. A well-trained mind can see painful feeling as impermanent, and then the negative sankharas, the negative thoughts based around that painful feeling, are impermanent. What's impermanent is not self. The Buddha didn't teach us just to believe that as a idea, a theory, but he actually said to witness it, to know it for yourself through your own experience. So that's in one of the hard parts of meditation, you being mindful of painful experiences in the body, painful memories, painful mental states, but seeing them as impermanent, seeing them through. And you need the patience to do that. But not just patience, you also need mindfulness, insight to support. That's something you can experiment with every day. And this is what monks like that monk I mentioned at the beginning, Lumo Buddha, did. They just kept watching and observing till they absolutely cleared the mind from any tendency to create suffering out of painful physical feelings, painful memories and mental feelings, mental states. Just got to the point where not going to do that anymore. Don't want suffering, and have enough awareness of mind, alertness, understanding, not to create suffering. And you can't remove pain from your life, because as long as you're a human being, you know, the imperfection of a human body and a human life is that, well, we'll have some pain. Some people have more than others. You know, life is like that. Karma is like that. But everyone has some pain at least. But the important thing is how you treat it. Are you creating a lot of negativity and suffering around this pain? Or are you able to be at peace with the pain that you have to face? If you practice this all the time, regularly, you get better at it. That's what we call progress. The progress of a well-trained mind, a well-practiced mind, is you get better at identifying attachment, greed, and aversion that comes up as the source of suffering. And then instead of running with the attachment, clinging on and becoming more caught up in more suffering, doing the opposite, going in the opposite direction and letting go. Letting go means you sometimes have to accept, I can't control everything. I can't get rid of every pain. Sometimes I just have to accept it, let go. Sometimes you can get rid of pain, but sometimes you can't. You can't get rid of every painful experience life brings you. You know, what other people say and do, how they are very difficult to control. You can't get away from every painful situation, but you can contemplate every painful situation. You can be mindful of every painful situation. You can be patient with every painful situation. You can use various qualities that you develop through your practice to deal with whatever unpleasant, painful situation arises. That much you can do. And then you can find an inner peace, even if you're still experiencing some pain. There's something else in the mind that is not in pain, that's not suffering. That's what grows through the practice. I'm fortunate enough to have met many good practitioners who became teachers and were able to explain and inspire by describing the well-trained mind, what it's like. And you may feel, oh, I can't do that, but at least they're giving you an idea of what it's like. So one I often quote is Lumo Buddha, the monk who is the abbot and teacher at Ajahn Chah's monastery and took over when Ajahn Chah died. Lumo Buddha, when I was a young monk once, he had to go into town and the man drove him into town in a car, and then he was coming back from town to the monastery having done his business, and the car was driving along the road and the driver was very tired and sleepy and fell asleep at the wheel. And as he fell asleep at the wheel, the car left the road. And as often happens in those situations, the driver wakes up because he's leaving the road, panics, straightens the wheel because he's been going off the road, but he straightened too quickly. He panicked and reacted too quickly. So by straightening the car, he actually put it into a roll. So the car that Lumo Buddha was sitting as a passenger in started to roll. And this road he's going along is a road that's been raised up above paddy fields, because the paddy fields get flooded in the rainy season. So it's a raised road. So the car started to leave that road, and it's raised up above the paddy fields. So as it left the road, it sort of went into midair, rolling, and it rolled over and over and over again. I think maybe 2 or 3 times the car rolled, Lumo Buddha in it, the driver in it, and then came to a stop. And then other people came to help, and luckily nobody was killed. They had some bruises, cuts and bruises, and they brought Lumo Buddha back to the monastery and tended to his bruises and injuries, sorted him out, got him a rest. And then later, as we do as junior monks, we always ask, oh, how did it happen? What happened? And then asked him, so Lumo Buddha, when the car started to leave the road and it was rolling, going through midair, and you don't know what's going to happen at that point. Are you going to survive? What did you think? How did you practice? How did you train your mind in that situation? That's an unusual, extreme situation, but still you like to ask. So he said, well, as we went through the air, I thought, maybe I'll die today, or maybe not. And then he just let go. He said, I just let go and we'll wait and see. Because there's nothing else you can do if you're going through the air very fast in an uncontrollable car, in an uncontrollable situation. There's nothing you can do other than watch your mind. And that's what you learn from meditation, how to watch your mind in all situations and keep it calm, cool, peaceful, even when you're flying through the air in a car that's in a car crash in a roll. And the car came to a stop, and obviously he didn't die. He's still alive today. That's the happy ending of the story. But The important thing was he maintained his mindfulness and reflected on impermanence, not self, and let go. But he didn't create any suffering out of that. He said, I didn't have fear. No fear. Panic. No panic. Worry. No worry. Just peaceful. Accepting it may be the moment he dies or maybe not. And it wasn't. But all of us will have to experience that in our lives. At the very least, at the end of our lives, there'll be the moment when you say, oh, this is the end of my life. You really don't know, do you, when that will come? But you know it will come one day. And that's will be one test of your well-trained mind is, are you able to maintain peace, mindfulness at that moment? Or will you get caught up in a lot of negative proliferation, anxiety, worry, fear, aversion, desire, clinging to things, whatever? But that, you might say, that's a good test of the well-trained mind. How does it cope at the end of life or with the threat of the end of life? Normally, we're not having that kind of extreme test, but every day we are put to the test. The behavior of people around us, the situations we get into, how our health is, our body is, the ups and downs, the experiences of daily life. We do have to face that every day. And there's a lot of unknowns. You can't predict everything. Don't know what tomorrow will bring. But you can cultivate these qualities through your training that help to remove the causes for confusion and suffering from your mind. That much we can do. So this is the Buddhist path, the path of identifying suffering, its cause, and then removing the cause and getting towards the end of suffering. So this is my encouragement for you in the new year. This should be a year for cultivating the end of suffering rather than increasing your suffering. See what you can do to end the suffering in your life as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So maybe I'll leave the talk there, and if there's any questions afterwards, do our best to answer them.
Handamayang Dhammakataya Sadhukarang Dadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodami